we don't need to be listening to that. But it also doesn't tell me when the timestamp is, so we might just have to like get close enough and then watch a little bit of the before. Bethany, what are you eating? That looks amazing. Oh.
It's 2 chocolate cookies with buttercream frosting in the middle. I opted for that instead of a bagel.
Started here, and probably have to listen to another. Yeah.
I'm not seeing the screen. Oh wait, I'm not seeing the screen. Can you see it, Bethany? Okay, then it's probably my computer about to blow up.
Yeah, it's showing it. It's just she, thank God, is blocking the stupid commercials.
Okay.
I mean, if you guys want to listen to the commercials, I can play those all day.
No, and the scene that we get to, it should be like the Asian woman sitting at a table with her kid and her like native grandpa about to talk.
You see that coverage? Get help with expenses health insurance doesn't cover. .com.
I was worried he'd love you more someday. But he doesn't.
What the heck? One second. Because you guys can't see anything, right?
Yeah, maybe stop sharing for a second and then pull it back up.
Haha.
And I don't know if we want to talk about this before it comes up, that we can record it. Prior to this episode, her husband had killed her brother and shot him and not talked to her about it. And then her sister-in-law then commits suicide, and the kids are all, parentless. And Casey can't seem to go a week without accidentally murdering someone over and over and over. And so like when this scene happens, you keep in mind in the fact that people have been murdered, including her brother.
Right. On the reservation.
I think off too. Like he then goes to kill people like left and right everywhere.
Oh yeah, but though her brother was killed on the reservation.
Yeah.
I don't know why this is being this way.
Don't mind you.
That's what your father wanted.
Because you guys still can't see it, can you?
I remember the first time I saw you. So wild. So angry. God, you were beautiful.
I could go eject it out of my computer and throw it in my DVD player and hold a laptop up to it.
I'm just wondering why. Because I can see it on my own computer.
Mhm.
It's just when I start to share, it has a. Here, maybe if I do that.
Maybe
I wonder if that's like a Zoom block thing.
I was actually wondering what if Peacock did that so it couldn't be shared.
I'd be so upset. Let me try and finagle. It probably is.
Have you watched it before, Bethany? So me and Bethany have technically watched it if you just want to play.
Okay. I'm watching.
Yeah, that's Rip and Beth. Have you seen Yellowstone?
Mm-mm.
So that's not who we're talking about.
Okay.
What's that? It's for this. We're moving? No one
Is
Where are
it?
you moving?
can. In a bit, but yes, I can in a bit. The university offers housing for faculty.
What about Casey?
It's closer to Casey.
That's not what I mean. You gotta really think about the decisions you make, honey.
I have thought about it. Feels right. For Tate and for me.
Remember this. You two were married in ceremony, not in some courthouse. Ceremony. That means you're married to him in the afterlife, no matter what you do in this life. You two are stuck together. Want to decide something? Decide how you two are going to work it out. You will be miserable forever.
So that's the end of that. And that is so awful. I mean, we kind of learned about it in our class about the shame attached to women leaving from their family and from the church. I do know somebody at my old workplace who had an order of protection against her ex-husband, and the church didn't allow her to come back after they had a divorce and a protection order. And a lot of tribes were very progressive about women's rights. And like, if a woman wanted to leave, they left. And this whole thing misrepresented as a romantic love story. If you watch the extras in it too, Kelsey Chow, who's changed her name from Not Chow so that so many people won't recognize that she's not Native, she's like, it's just so beautiful. They're married in ceremony and they're so in love. And the basic story after this is that she's like, oh, well, he's really hot. You know, he murdered my brother, but that's no big deal.
Yeah, I mean, it just perpetuates, that violence and violence on reservations. And so why would that not be perpetuating, missing murdered Indigenous women? And that's just kind of why we thought it was relevant to include this, is how the negative stereotypes are being perpetuated in the media and then misrepresented, right? So, I mean, yeah, there probably is some community out there that would probably say something similar, but to blanket all tribes as having that, no.
And this is like the grandpa whose son was murdered telling her, like, it doesn't matter if my son was murdered. You're married to him. And this is what happens when outsiders tell our story. This is why it's so important for us to tell our story so that BS like this doesn't come out. Like Taylor Sheridan, who made this series, and Wind River thinks he's helping the missing murdered Indigenous women. And when I see stuff like this, when I see Kelsey Chow naked and having sex every chance she can get out in the woods in a shower after somebody's murdered, and I'm just like screaming like, why? How many women alone from this video are getting murdered and raped because of this hurtful narrative? These are recent. These are like cutting edge narratives coming out. This isn't something from 1990s. This isn't Dances with Wolves. This is stuff coming out right now. And, when they had a horrible episode about the missing murdered Indigenous women, like Native people were like,
she also
yeah,
was the lead in.
And it was awful. Like, we could talk about 45 minutes about how awful it was. But they were like, thank you, Yellowstone, for telling this story. And I'm like, don't thank them for a harmful stereotype. Like,
Yeah,
this is
they're
not helpful.
perpetuating that stereotype and actually like creating awareness on how people can be set up to be caught. So like those entrapment situations. So no, they did not do any justice. And actually, Kelsey Chow is the lead role in Wind River. So again, just kind of when we're talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women, people automatically go to her as this icon, this media icon regarding it, and then there's so much misinformation. And it's because those non-native voices are telling the story.
I'm trying to form words and it's not really going well in my head. So I guess like just from watching the clip, so I'm gonna kind of form what I think is happening. I have not seen Yellowstone in its entirety, so I'm trying to kind of piece it all with the topic that we're discussing. And for, at least in watching it, I feel like they're totally condoning in a situation where an Indigenous woman is in this type of relationship where something like the murder of her brother happens. They're totally condoning sticking with the abuser or the accused for ceremony, quote unquote, in the honor of ceremony. And so when we're talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women, I feel like that's an awful, awful stereotype to put on the culture and the community. I can't even fathom. Like, I always go back to like, what if this was, you know, 2 white actors? Like, people would be having an absolute fit.
Yeah,
I don't know. Sancho, please stop me.
So there's a book I think it's called Killing the Indian Maiden by Rubio, and they talk about this stereotype has existed since the inception of film, is that, and it's also a way white people love this narrative because it eases their colonial guilt of genocide and stealing the land, is that a white person goes into an indigenous community, an Indian princess or an Indian air quotes squaw stereotype meets with him. He, you know, she of course gives up her tribe, the Tonto enforcer stereotype that we're gonna like uplift this great white person. And then the Indian princess or Indian squaw has to die so that the white man can return to society and carry that benediction of you have some blessing from the Indian princess or you have some DNA from that relative that then makes it so that you aren't the colonizer. And this is why we have so many stories about the great-great-grandmother Cherokee princess, is people hope to have that tie so that they don't, when they're learning about colonialism, when they're learning about genocide, when they're learning about the missing murdered Indigenous women, that they can absolve themselves from that guilt. So this is a long, ongoing, 150-year-old narrative. Yeah.
Exactly. And how violence against any Indigenous individual is okay, because first off, we don't have law to protect them, right? Especially if they are on reservation, where the shooting did take place on reservation. And then we're gonna have the white savior come in, right? And so I think that like it's really important that we look at this narrative when we are talking about how we need to break it down, right? We need to break down that lack of access to proper data, right? We don't have any type of data tracking mechanism for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And it's not, so reporting of missing and murdered Indigenous women is not held to the same standard as somebody like Gabby Patillo in all of that situation, right? So
Nature's
we
way
really
believes it.
need to be extra diligent when we're talking about this, because nobody's wanting to talk about it, right? Because it's coming from a community of color, and you know, that does not promote white supremacy culture. So how do we break that down?
Yeah, and this is why we need to tell our own stories, because we could have seen that coming a mile away and been like, dude, that is not cool. It's important to, Kelsey Chow's story actually perfectly embodies this. She was told she had Cherokee great-great-grandmother. So when she did River and when she started on Yellowstone, she has interviews saying, this is reconnecting me with my Native roots. It's so beautiful. And then Native actors and actresses rarely ever get asked to audition for a role that's not Native. So this was one of those very, very few roles, and it went to a non-Native. Even if it did go to Native women, it would have been doubtful that she would have the power to insist that the narrative is wrong. This is what happens when we bring in tokenized consultants and not, directors, writers, actors, the entire crew. And that's why Rutherford Falls and Reservation Dogs were so different. And it actually ended up, it may have been Adam Beach, who's native and has been like, he was in Smoke Signals. He was like, does anybody in the Cherokee Nation know Kelsey Chow? And the Cherokee Nation is like, no, we don't. And so she was publicly caught in that like, oops, this is what happens when we perpetuate that narrative, is people do think they're indigenous. They do go and make some type of gaffe like this. And these aren't harmless stories people are telling.
Exactly. And, I'm not big on the hashtag pretend Indian. However, it brings to light what, we're really trying to deconstruct, right? We really need folks to stop perpetuating those false narratives, right? Not every indigenous individual is a drunken Indian, right? Not every indigenous individual is running away from the reservation and that's why they're missing. That's not why. Yeah, they've probably been victimized, but that doesn't mean that they ran away. Most likely somebody came into town for a powwow or what have you and decided that little Jenny looked beautiful and wanted to take her with him. And we were talking about earlier too, about how we don't have the data to identify those trends. Like, it would be really beneficial to know what dates, folks were actually missing, because then we could see if it is tied to different cultural events, say like community power. Anybody's welcome to come and participate. And is that like where these
the media and films have portrayed? But I also think I feel like we're kind of at a at least for me, I feel very fresh out of the topic because we just talked about this in our class. But I feel like, Bethany, with what you were saying, and Sancha, about telling your story, is it can't just be indigenous people, right? Like, like protesting and talking about it and trying to get other people to talk about it. White people need to be the ones to talk about it. We need, we have to be the ones that are like this, like, because it's not going to happen otherwise, like it's going to continuously be indigenous communities, saying we need these things, and privileged white people just kind of being like, oh, okay, like, sure. So
we're going to make a movie, correctly,
exactly,
because we didn't use proper consultation or have an actual indigenous person telling their story. Mm-hmm. That's what happens, though. So yes, I agree, other races need to be involved in telling and getting involved in the movement, but they have to be doing it in the correct way.
Right, exactly.
Right? We're never going to be able to get accurate data if we don't get white people involved, right? We have to get law enforcement, federal government, everybody to come to the table and want to track this data and actually track the data, mm-hmm. right? So it's super important, like exactly what you're saying. We have to get white people involved, but at the same time, they have to listen to the story of how they need to be tracking it and using indigenous methodologies.
Correct.
To do
Yeah,
so.
no, perfectly said. Because we looked at what we're looking at in class, like the Washington State Patrol report. That is exactly what you're talking about. Like, they got involved, but not in the right way at all. And it was a poor and awful excuse of a report to even put out to the public and to even partake in my opinion. I also think at the root of it, there needs to be a call to action with that legislation, like what you were talking about. it's, you know, it starts there. Well, it starts at the bare minimum. Like, the bare minimum is just, you know, meaningful consultation. And just having the respect of Indigenous communities to want to have that data, right? And partake in the research. But I just don't know how that would even start. Like, looking at the Washington State Patrol report makes me so discouraged, because that was an opportunity. That was an opportunity for the state to be like, okay, we can start doing this, right? We can open up all these different avenues for collecting data on missing and murdered Indigenous women, and they just screwed the pooch. Like, absolutely dropped the ball. So I don't know. After that, I'm not feeling super optimistic, as you can probably tell.
Yeah, so I think it's important for the work to be Native led because we know where things are wrong. When white people, it is important for them to be involved because they are the ones attacking us. So that's why my capstone is focusing on the psychology of the missing, murdered Indigenous women. What is happening in the minds of non-Native men as they decide that children are age compressed, when they decide that Native bodies are more deserving of extreme violence, like I talked about in class, of broken noses and compound fractures during rapes and cutting up of bodies when they're disposed of. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when in Canada, when they did it, so they had talking circles, but they actually brought witnesses in to witness the talking circles, because this isn't just a Native problem. It's not you Native people go hang out in a gym somewhere, talk about things, and then never involve us and it'll be fixed. Like, this is a problem of, you know, like, what is this? Baldwin, James Baldwin. When he was in France and people asked him to talk about the Negro problem in America. And he's like, oh, America doesn't have a Negro problem. It has a white supremacy problem that we need to be making sure to correctly attributing these root sources to where they're from. And oftentimes they focus on what Native women were doing when they were targeted, not what made them targeted. And it's these things like the laws we learned about, media representations, inaccurate history, so that people don't learn about Native people. And I think it's like kind of a good segue to go into the Wind River, because we see that negative poverty porn. And when we frame things in that way, like a lot of agencies are like, Native people are the poorest people in the country and they live in hovels. You know, sometimes that's true, but there's positive as well. And if you're not focusing on the positive, which there are many amazing Native things, like I love being Native and I would never trade that, even if I could trade away all the sexual assaults. Like, I would still be Native. And our methodology, we've talked about our methodologies and the love of our culture, the love of the land, the love of our food and our people. And when you frame more poverty porn like Wind River and Yellowstone, you're increasing the narrative that our lives are garbage and our reservations are garbage. So it is okay to go in there, because we're a air quote shithole country. How could it get any worse? And these things that
and
are,
that's why we're victimized, right?
Yeah.
Because we're not worthy. And when they say that we're garbage, that's why it is, just like you said, the psychology behind it, we are minimized to be garbage. And so when we are victimized, we're not seen as victim, we are seen as garbage. And just because kids are victimized and brutalized as kids on reservations and may not make the best choices, they are then put into the legal system and the criminal justice system, another system of oppression, right? Or they're put in boarding schools, which is another system of oppression on Indigenous populations. But they then victimize them further in that system. We know that individuals that were in residential schools were victimized. It's been very documented, right? So when those people were at home, they reported that violence. and then now it's an indigenous problem. No, it was created by white supremacy culture. White people did this to us. White people hurt Sancha. White people hurt me. So it just, people need to understand that just because we are an indigenous population does not mean that we are less than, and does not mean that we can be victimized and not be reported and not be treated as victims.
And most of these systems that have been the last 150 years have all been ways to air quote fix us. Everybody thought they were doing good things that led to further traumatization, like allotment and termination and boarding schools, then the 60s scoop, and now people trying to dismantle ICWA, which is the Indian Child Welfare Act, which prioritizes keeping Native children in Native communities so that they are healthy and whole. And through all of these narratives, if you go back and look to them, they look amazing on paper. We're gonna like manifest destiny and bring these Native people into Christianity and positive lives and turn them into functioning members of our society. And with boarding schools in the 60s scoop, we're going to spread white supremacist education and we're going to uplift these Native people. And the current battles for ICWA are wealthy white families who want to adopt a baby, and Indigenous babies are one of the highly sought after ones because it's one of the more acceptable air quote races. And a Native baby runs about $80,000, but people would rather have a Native baby for that same type of thing that I talked about, that tie that frees them from their colonial guilt. And I often phrase it as, this is them wanting their anchor baby, that this baby will free them from racism, even though they're going to destroy that Native child's lives, because we have story after story after story of people who were taken from Native families, adopted by white families, and often raped in those families. And even if they weren't raped, they were still told that their culture wasn't valid, and they were disconnected, and they fell into the same colonial trauma that Ree did, being abused, even if they grew up in an ideal suburban home. You know, these are all connected, and all were good intentions.
I muted myself, sorry. I mean, beautiful points there, Sancha. Like 100%. They really need to do, listen to our stories and our bodies in order to be able to protect us, right? They say they want to protect us as Indigenous women, or I would say any Indigenous individual. I mean, there are 3 Indigenous individuals in my household, and all 3 have been victimized, regardless of gender. And that is the most important thing that we need to, is in order to protect and advocate and do the work, we have to be able to provide the data in order to get this white supremacy culture to really understand the story and support the initiative and the work. Just the call to action that you were talking about, Lexi, it's so important for us to be able to actually provide that data to protect this population.
Yeah, and being in this program, I think we're continually not pushed, but, you know, guided into this idea of this, you know, you're advocating for this, and I don't know, I guess, like, when I think about murdered and missing Indigenous women, it's not just about advocating, right? It's about taking responsibility for what has happened and doing our absolute most to bring attention to it and make way for the people that know the culture best to kind of almost put us in our place, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, totally. I can't remember, Sancha, you'll have to help me.
It's like self-determination and...
Right. Eric talked about it, but he quoted someone, I think. we don't just need advocates, we need accomplices, right? We need white people that aren't afraid to get, put in jail with us, or, go to the front lines with us, because we need those accomplices in order to take proper action.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm just thinking about the data that we looked at, and this has kind of been on my brain for the last couple weeks, just working with you two and diving into my own research and just kind of educating myself. Also, there's some great TikTok people who talk a lot about Native culture, and there's even a guy named Lance who calls out people and he says, "Hey colonizer, how's it going?" So I've been doing a lot of just my own research, and I would love to know your guys' ideas on how someone like myself can be more than just an advocate, can be that, that person that not necessarily stands next to you, but maybe amplifies you and stands behind you and says, "I'm here with you."
So one of the things that I talk about is when people do land acknowledgements, they usually like to do a really fuzzy one that makes them feel good. And my number one suggestion or complaint when people come to me for feedback on that is we need to be acknowledging that colonization is an ongoing process. It is not something that happened a long time ago and has stopped. We can see that with the missing and murdered Indigenous women. The fact that we've got thousands of women missing, we don't even have the data yet, but we're starting to have the data that Native women are almost universally raped. Like, that means we need to be doing something now to stop it. One of the biggest things allies can do is funding money towards, Indigenous researcher. Like me and Colette are starting our own nonprofit because as the Department of Health in Pierce County has reached out to us, they've been stepping in poo because they're sending white people, or they're uplifting, I won't do that because I don't want to get anybody in trouble, is a white organization picking which natives to uplift is also a problem if they're not picking people trained in Indigenous methodologies. Like, I didn't learn it here in Evergreen. I didn't learn it at UW. I learned it at Northwest Indian College. So people need to be prioritizing people who are trained in Indigenous methodologies that have that experience, because so often they care about credentials on paper. And it needs to be so much more. And I feel like funders are finally getting to the place where they're acknowledging that they need to divert money to people of color and Native people to do this work. So our nonprofit did get $188,000 in grants in 2 months because there's a vacuum outside of King County. Like, King County alone has a lot of advocacy, but in the city of Seattle, they have at least 3, if not more, organizations doing this work, but there's a vacuum outside of King County. So there's nobody in Pierce County, which is like, wow, like if we start a nonprofit, we can fill that role. And the Department of Health's first response to us when we talked about the harm of coming into a Native community, saying, how did you experience racism? Not being prepared for how that exploded, not having any resources in place. And also it was done as bad community-based participatory research. The people that were funding the program to get this data were not there, and we wanted them to be there because, especially in Pierce County, a lot of the hospitals and health departments contract out to religious organizations. And is that an appropriate avenue to be doing Native outreach with the history of boarding schools and Every Child Matters? Like when I first moved to Washington State, I had $50 and that was it. I had to instantly find a place to live, a job instantly to pay rent, and food was very low on that list. And I refused to go to a church for a food pantry because I would have rather starved than go in there, because the church's role was so instrumental in my rapes. My white Catholic father had all of that white supremacist patriarchy, so he thought he owned us and he had access to our bodies. And then the 2 Native men who attacked me, one of them, their father went to a boarding school, and when he was raising his children, he made them rape each other. And I imagine the 3rd man has a similar story. The church has been so instrumental in Manifest Destiny, the doctrine of discovery, and the rape of our people, that they should not be doing any social services for Native people. That's it.
I'm trying to see if this will let me
So that should be at around timestamp 48 minutes.
Yeah, it's not gonna let me show it. Oh, dang it! I love that actor.
Is that Jeremy Renner?
Yeah, gosh dang it.
He's okay. I mean, he didn't write the movie.
I just really like him in all of the Marvel movies.
He was okay. I would say that this was definitely Taylor Sheridan's dropping the ball for this portrayal. Like, how is Jeremy Renner supposed to know? Like, I'm sure if Jeremy Renner was in charge, that he would have maybe paid somebody, a native person, to write the story.
You look forward to it, 3 hots and a cup hot and free cable. Everything's better to be in here the way they see it.
Let's just test their DNA against Steven and see if that tells us.
Can I talk to him?
No, worry. Anything they tell you would be inadmissible in court, and then anything you tell us would render everything that resulted admissible as well.
Well, if I didn't tell you, I just knew it.
Yeah, Agent Bennett? Yes, sir.
Ben, I've known this kid since he could walk.
I gotta canvass the house. The back door locks me inside. You. It's you. Not living shit.
All you've been doing is shit for the last few years, Chip.
This place, man. What it takes from us. What it took from you.
I'm not gonna stand here and tell you that life's fair, 'cause it ain't. To either of us. But, what to do? This land is all we got left.
This is we shit. One thing native about you is your ex-wife, the daughter you couldn't protect. Maybe if you played detective.
That's not something you get talking about. You hear me? You gonna lecture me about protecting people? Like you did the shit that's killing him? Unlike most people, you had every chance to get the hell out of here if that's what you want. You had the army, you had college, whatever. It was your choice. Look what you chose. Look what you chose. God damn you.
I met him.
Yeah?
Yeah, motherfucker was almost as old as you. I wanted to bite his ass, too. Natalie wouldn't let me. Guess love really is blind, huh? He worked security on one of them drill sites.
His boyfriend have a name?
Matt something. I don't know.
He does.
Sam do. Why don't you ask him?
I think he'll be talking to Sam long before I do.
Think this is who I wanted to be? Man. I get so mad. I'm gonna fight the whole world. You got any idea what that feels like?
I decided to fight the feeling instead. Decided to take the world with win.
So that's the end of that scene with the door.
What did I tell you? Did he say anything? No, fuck, I don't
So
know.
that's the end of the scene.
After the rigs marriage.
So we see in that interrogation-ish thing that Jeremy Reiner's all like, you could have like got out of here. You could have been somebody that he was off the reservation and could have like gone to college. And the entire movie doesn't show any cultural positivity about the reservation. There's no like powwows, there's no good food. It goes farther onto that, what is that female's name that was Scarlet Witch? You know, she ends up, there's a shootout and all the tribal police die. And Jeremy Renner just goes in and saves her and drags her out when she's shot. And she's like having this self-actualization in the middle of a field of dead natives. And just that prioritizing of whiteness, but especially that scene there where he's like, there's nothing of value here. All the natives are drunk and drug users. And they have a scene where one native is cutting up her wrist in front of everyone. And it's in this portrayal, the reservation is this desolate wasteland where native people are just waiting for death.
Yeah, that's the mom of the victim of the murdered woman, who is Kelsey Chow, by the way.
And this was made by Taylor Sheridan, who keeps getting money to make these stories, and should not be getting money. And I guess like one of our call to actions would be like, consumers need to demand better media, back up the money, subscribe to Hulu for Reservation Dogs, watch Rutherford Falls on Peacock. And when you see these awful portrayals, those happen for a reason, and consumers need to make their voices heard in that, to demand Native directors, Native writers, Native actors, so that this garbage doesn't keep being made, because there's 150 years of this garbage. It's an old narrative that people are fixated on.
Are there any like documentaries or movies about missing and murdered Indigenous women that you guys would recommend for just like further education? I know that there's a lot of stuff on the media, like in the media, Instagram, Facebook, all those things, but is there anything like kind of in the film category that we could watch that wouldn't be so culturally inappropriate?
There's a lot of YouTube stuff coming out of Canada. So there's like the Drag the Red Project. They have a couple of YouTube videos. They have one where Al Jahira, I might be mispronouncing that, actually goes on a Drag the Red trip and takes part in a training of forensic people that come out and train the volunteers how to search riverbanks for body parts. I'm trying to think if there is a documentary that isn't bad like this. There was is it Crime Me Outside? Was a Canadian Adam Beach show and movie. And it was back in the 90s and highlighted a story like this, where a white person kills a Native girl and gets off in a very, very short sentence. And so kind of the semi-plot of the show is how the boys decide they're going to punish the white person when they get out. And I'm going to ruin it, but you also probably can't see it because it's in Canada. It was for a while on Hoopla, which you can get from a lot of your libraries. And at the end, they have this elaborate plan on how to murder the guy at a bar, and they all end up getting arrested, but the guy ends up dead, and they're trying to figure out who did it. Like, did you have a chance to do it? No. Did you? And they basically all get out, and the concluding is that her friend murdered him while they were creating the distraction. And so that Moribio, who did the book that I talked about earlier about killing the Indian maiden, so she wasn't Native. So her intro is amazing about how she ties all this violence together, but her reviews of movies are hit or miss because she's not Native. So she didn't like that movie because it focused on Native men and not Native women. And I was like, this was the 1990s, and it was the women who took control in the end. That was actually one of the beautiful things on the story. And this was in the 90s, way before the missing murdered Indigenous women was gaining foothold in media. There's the Drag the Red Project. There is a lot of stuff. Canada's really good about making like YouTube videos, the different organizations, and especially about truth and reconciliation. I don't think we have one here.
Yeah, Canada is really leading the way in this. There's If I Go Missing from 2019. is essentially like a huge wake up call regarding the problem of missing Indigenous youth. And it's really where the law enforcement and communities come together. And this movie is just really great because it unfortunately talks about this beautiful young Tina Fontaine, who is 15, that's found in the river. And this Brianna Johnny really goes at the Winnipeg police force as well as other city and government officials when she was only 14, right? So here's another Indigenous youth leading this charge, because what if she goes missing? What is actually going to happen? And it is about the Red River. The film does talk about the banks of the notorious Red River. And so it's really important that, you know, people diversify their knowledge in this. And Indigenous women from America and Canada are both experiencing the same thing. And the one thing COVID has done is shut down that border. So it hasn't been as easy for that trafficking to happen, but it really has been perpetuated through the Americas. And so that's what people need to understand, that Indigenous is Indigenous to the Americas, not just the United States.
And there is in Canada a true crime show called Taken, I think. And whenever I go up there, I like to watch it. And they zoom in on one of these data points, and talk about the stories. And it's really powerful because when you hear numbers like 5,000 are missing, it's easy to forget that those are people, that those are mothers and sisters. And they also show the narrative that, you know, that I talked about, that any girl who gets in a car for any reason, including public transportation, because there's no buses, is deemed a prostitute. There is a book that came out of Canada that's available in the United States. It's also available on audiobook, because for me, I do so much reading. If I don't have an audiobook, it's not going to get read. And it's called Highway of Tears, A True Story of Racism. And it's by Jessica McDermott. And this talks about the Highway of Tears is one of those highways where so many women go missing. So they zoom into some of these stories, not Tina Fontaine, because she was over in the Red River, which is Winnipeg is actually nicknamed Murder Peg because so many Native women get murdered there. It's just a regular, like in that Taken show, they're like, we're back in Winnipeg again and again and again. And so,
like,
yeah.
There's another book written by Stevie Cameron that is that they based a show on the farm, and it's about where there's an individual that has murdered nearly 50 marginalized women in Vancouver. So Vancouver, Canada is just like Winnipeg in one section of it, I should say, right? Like there's areas within Vancouver that, you know, people go missing and they don't care about because they came from the wrong side of the tracks, right? Kind of like on reservation, off reservation similarities, right?
Yeah, and there's the podcast Finding Cleo, which I don't like because they drag that out. Like I've listened to like 5 episodes and they still haven't gotten to it because they repeat the same stuff over and over. They add a lot of drama to the storytelling. Like it really could have been done in 2 or 3 and it shouldn't be taking 8 hours to drag out the story.
Right?
Yeah.
They do that so often. And yeah, in that Red River Woman, that came out in 2015. Shades of Our Sisters is a beautiful collaboration that was in 2017, where Indigenous student, film student collaborated with missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans and Two-Spirits, celebrating the lives and the memories of this individual. So it's really important that we, you know, understand that our trans sisters and our Two-Spirit brothers and sisters are also being murdered and going missing every day as well.
Yeah, and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report in Canada is actually a really down to earth read. Like they do heavily invest in Native consultation. Um, it's like 800 pages, but it's still a good read to flip through. I mean, it's about awful, but they really, really go into all these root causes. They call out the media, they call out police, they call out the history of police interaction, they call out the boarding schools, they call out the school systems. It really, normally when I encounter readings, I have my like white supremacist red pen and just launch into a reading expecting it's going to be awful and deconstructing it from the first word. And the Truth and Reconciliation report, which is about the boarding schools, and then led to the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women report, they're pretty amazing, and I've used them to cite. And also really instrumental in those reports is they had call to actions at the end that many cities and other governments are using those calls to actions as a framework to start to dismantle these systems.
For those of you who are listening, I've also started to listen to on audiobook because I'm like Sancha and I have almost zero time to actually read. The Beginning and End of Rape by Sarah Deer. I have been learning a lot, and one of the first things that she talks about is violence against Native women is not an epidemic. It's biological and blameless. And I think that's such a powerful statement to make, and I think we need to really examine how we use the word epidemic in the situation, because that's taking away the blame, and there is blame to be put on to white supremacy and privilege and this patriarchal domination of Native American women, and especially doing that on tribal land. But yeah, I feel like there's so much. I want to read all of it. I will spend the rest of my life doing so.
Yeah, I have that book, but I actually checked it out first from Northwest Indian College, and so I have to go back and highlight it for, of course, all the quotes. And yeah, I like how she really does, each chapter goes into these various causes, the laws. And I mentioned in our class that she had a chapter on restorative justice, and she's like, I'm highly suspect of that, because I feel like when they're Native offenders, that will minimize the harm that Native offenders are doing. And it's important to acknowledge that there are Native people that are attacking Native people, but it is not the majority. Like it's like 30%. And of those 30%, we know that many of them were abused themselves as children, that abuse, I hesitate to say generational trauma, because I feel like it says that the trauma happened a long time ago and it's not ongoing. There are still people alive who were in boarding schools. Those were shut down in the 90s. So that's not ancient history. And there are still Native people, young boys being raped today.
Because those boarding schools are still actually in effect. Like these schools, these residential schools are still there. And it makes me think about how many actually Indigenous men and women, or girls and boys, went missing that we don't have accounted for, that aren't buried, aren't on site, that they were trafficked and just disposed of somewhere. There's so many that are unaccounted for, and that generational, when we talk about generational trauma, you said it best. It's not something that happened in the past. It's something that is continually being perpetuated in each generation. And no matter how much healing that family might do, it's still in our blood. That's what people don't understand, is that is in our DNA. It's in us. And my grandmother went, and she would be like in her 90s today, but that doesn't mean that it didn't directly, which it heavily did, and it doesn't mean that it didn't impact all of my siblings and myself. My mom was horribly victimized as a kid and abused by step-parents and everything, and she got into a horrible relationship and was victimized in that. And it doesn't mean when we talk about that generational trauma, it doesn't mean that it happened so far in the past. And I'm so grateful you brought that up, Sancha, because it is continually being perpetuated in each generation and not by choice. It's because we are meant to be the victims because of white supremacy culture. They think it's okay to victimize us.
I was really hopeful when I heard Indian Horse was being made. So it was released several years ago over in Canada. And I think it was just like within the last year, finally brought on Netflix so that we could watch it here. And they did not get an Indigenous director or producer. And they basically said because of that movie, Windrunner, the Inupiaq movie that was done in Native language, in a Native place, that nobody would ever be that Indigenous, so we shouldn't stop. And so I had seen a review of it before it came out, and I want to read the review here because it's so powerful to all Native media. And I wish I had the citation, it's just in the middle of a slideshow. It's being paraded as an Indigenous film, but it's not. It's taking up space, and that's what settlers do. It's about them taking up space. It's about them choosing which stories have value. It's about them choosing whose voices should be heard. There's so many incredible Indigenous filmmakers out there. There's so many smart and talented people who have been working so hard and whose work is incredible. Those are the films we should be talking about. It's yet another film about Indigenous people by non-Indigenous people for non-Indigenous people. It was made for a settler audience to have this emotional catharsis and walk away feeling like they did something. So when Indian Horse was released and we watched it, it was hit or miss because they portrayed the violence as Native children just happened to murder themselves. Oops, what an accident. And it was nuns and priests murdering people. And so we're seeing that in the Every Child Matters, that they're using that ground penetrating sonar to find how many bodies are buried on these places. And in some, it's thousands. And the movie lets that go. Because they aren't Indigenous and they don't know how to tell the story in the correct way. They have no idea what they're doing. They're throwing darts at a dartboard in the dark and they're missing it. And they got the money. They took up the space. They made the boarding school movie. So we probably have like 2 hours to make a closing.
I know. I was like thinking about how we should close this, and I think really kind of closing with the different, different films and different movies and stuff like that might be a good, encouraging. I think you guys really did a great job about encouraging folks to read or read these things or listen to these audiobooks to really expand their understanding, but also make sure that they are reading and learning from an Indigenous individual. That it's important to have that Indigenous voice in your learning as we see how well or how incorrectly it can be done as we
So
did in this podcast.
I have 4 calls to action, but we could also close it out with some really fun Indigenous content. I don't think we'll be able to use, we do have the Tribe Called Red, so we can mention that. The song from here was a Tribe Called Red. I really love Bougie Natives, but I'm not sure if we can get the rights to that because that's actually they used to be considered a dialect of my tribe, but they want to be their own tribe now, which is fine. It doesn't hurt me. But so when I see Tribe Called Red, of course, it's the Plains Native, that Pan Native. We don't feel like we're real natives until we've been on a horse in a teepee. So when I first had that come up on Pandora, and I was like, this is amazing. What is this? And I was trying to decide if I liked it or not. And so I pulled up the YouTube video and I was like, this looks really familiar. And then he has a scene where he's like, my blood be thicker than Ooligan grease. And he has the Ooligan grease in a jar. And that was our food. And I'm like, oh my God, as a Tsimshian, an Alaska Native, there I am more closely represented. But we probably can't. I'll have to explore. They're probably copyrighted. But if not, there are YouTube videos of a sketch in Canada on their Indigenous people station called Caution May Contain Nuts, and they are hilarious because Native people are hilarious. So if you make a Native sketch show, it's going to be really funny. And so let me see if I can I'll probably have to share it with you guys to share because my computer's been trying to blow up all day. Let me see.
That's fine. I think though we do need to have like our calls to action embedded within, but
Mhm.
also at the end. I don't have it with me because I'm not at home, but I think that it's important if you could share those call to actions. I know you and I really labeled them out in our discussion that one day, and I just don't think that
I have 4 here and I can just go through them really quick.
Please. Yes.
So what can you do? Here are some good calls to action of how to make change as consumers demand better media that is authentically produced. Go subscribe to Hulu for Reservation Dogs and Peacock for Rutherford Falls, which both had Native actors, Native writers, and people involved with the content. Call out Taylor Sheridan for taking up space and money and really making a more awful situation. Ask government and funders, especially in our MPA program, prioritize getting money to Native-led organizations to do research, and don't be doing research on Native organizations because that doesn't roll out well. And in those funding, listen to the Native people for Native evaluation and milestones. So I have been working with some funders who were very open, like, let us know if this isn't culturally relevant. I've let them know that they were asking for private or sacred or community-owned knowledge, and they changed it. So be open to that flexibility. Demand action from...
Yeah, like indigenize your philanthropy when you're ask for things that you don't have the rights to know or understand.
Yeah, demand action from lawmakers and vote. My internet might be unstable. And in Washington state and other states, demand and implement since time immemorial curriculum. So you learn this in high school. So everybody learns this. So Native people aren't stuck doing Native 101 for every person they ever meet, including advanced tribal consultation, because that keeps us from getting to transformational change because we are stuck getting everyone up to speed over and over. That's what I have for calls of action. And then let me share the video here that somebody else could share screen on. So this is Caution May Contain Nuts, a Canadian sketch group. It's pretty amazing. It's where I go when I need. Does somebody want to share screen?
I will.
Chamber with chronotones or some other bullshit explanation. We have calibrated these to teleport matter not only across space, but through time.
The Prime Directive must be adhered to on this mission, perhaps even more so than when we visit alien planets. We must not interfere in any way with the cultures we encounter.
Of course.
In any way, Captain.
I'm aware of the Prime Directive, Leonard. Newfie, 2 to beam down.
Submit your planet's past, Captain. Here we see natives of the landmass known as North America signing a treaty with their European counterparts.
Yes. Honey, I've dropped my communicator. Could you get...
Of course, Captain.
So, he can't really sign this.
I think next.
Oh, yes, yeah, an X. We'll legally accept an X. What is the meaning?
Look, don't sign that treaty. Here, this phaser. That's all. That's kill. Stun is somewhere in between. I have the schematics. And a few others as well. Photon torpedoes, warp drive, a few other things. I don't have the food replicators in there, but you should be able to extrapolate that from the transporter technology. Okay? Good enough. Captain, let's go, Leonard. 2 to beam up. And so he asked me, why are the... And I said, because they don't work in the future either. Captain on the bridge. Welcome back, Captain. I trust the mission was a success.
Captain, might I have a word?
Yes, what is it, Leonard?
I believe your actions in the past may have created an alternative universe.
Correction, Leonard.
Captain,
Later, Leonard. I'll be on the sweat launch deck. Ladies, gentlemen, Eddies.
my.
I don't know if you guys found that funny because my computer was frozen.
Yes. All
I'm
right.
gonna stop recording.
Recording stopped.
I think I have